there everybody, welcome back to the channel. So today's video is really special for me, and I hope that you guys are going to enjoy it. So for all of the Infinity fans that are watching, either longtime supporters of me, or you're just a fan of the game and you happen to see the thumbnail and click, you're probably already aware that the pre-order window for the new combined army Sectorial, the next wave, has just launched. So there's going to be a new action pack for the Sectorial. Their first tag is in there, and then there's a special war core as well. Now, Corpus Belli actually reached out to a bunch of content creators a couple weeks ago, myself included, and massive shout out to them. They actually sent me some product to go over with you guys. And so I've got a copy of the action pack. I've also got the special pre-order Glyph Warcore miniature. And then I've also got the Juggernaut, the new tag. So in today's video, primarily we're going to be covering the action pack and going ahead and getting this painted. Now, I'm going for a relatively quick and easy sort of paint scheme. I'm kind of targeting this toward people who, you're hearing the hype about Infinity, you're really curious about getting into the game, but you find painting detailed miniatures somewhat intimidating. We're going to try a really nice, simple speed paint sort of process that will get you, the miniatures aren't going to win awards, but they will look decent and you can get it done really fast and get your first games in. Now, before we actually dive into the painting guide, I do want to talk a little bit about what you're actually going to get in this box. All right, so pardon the intrusion, it's editing Bernard here. So as I'm sitting here recording all of this footage, the lore section of the video, which I was hoping would be like 5 minutes, is super long. So there's going to be chapters down at the bottom of the video. If you want to listen to the lore, just keep watching the video through. But if you actually want to skip ahead to the painting, just use the chapters down below. So the next wave sectorial for the combined army faction focuses on the humans that were left behind inside combined army occupied territories during the various offensives that we've seen play out in the narrative of the Infinity universe over the past couple of decades since the game's been around. So on planets like Paradiso, where there were multiple offensives and the combined army was gaining and capturing a lot of ground, you ended up having a lot of human civilians that were kind of lost inside combined army territory. Now, depending upon which part of the combined army was controlling that territory, that kind of, varied the treatment that the humans that were there would receive. So, for instance, under Morat controlled territory, the humans were essentially treated as a expendable, rather, labor force, slave labor. Under the Shezvasti Expeditionary Force, they kind of operated more as a police state. And you figure with the Shezvasti being really good at infiltration and, disguising themselves as different species and everything, you can imagine the terror of, you don't know if your friend's been replaced by an alien and they're going to rat you out to the authorities. And then lastly, you have the Onyx Contact Force, which they also kind of operated as a police state, but because they had a heavy use of drones, which were essentially just programmed for police duty, humans actually fared fairly okay in those areas. It was still living under, martial law and would have been tough, but it was a cakewalk compared to life under the Morats' rule. Now, with the conclusion of the third offensive that we saw at the end of Infinity in 4, the Combined Army and O12 have a tentative peace agreement which allowed the Combined Army to retain control over the territories that they had won over the course of their various campaigns. And now that we have the failed blockades of the Combined Army fleet, we're starting to see more of the hegemony races and different, castes within their society making their way into the human sphere. And with that came an offer of citizenship for all of the humans that were within Combined Army controlled territories. Now, a lot of you may be wondering, like, what human in their right mind would actually, like, forsake, their previous allegiance to whichever, superpower they belonged to, whether it was Eugene or Pan-Oceania, and sign up for the Combined Army when, they were living in hostile, territory for so long. Well, there was a masterful propaganda campaign where essentially the hegemony, the sort of ruling diplomats of the EI, had essentially stated that humanity was partially at fault because initially the Combined Army was there actually looking for alien relics, and O12 preemptively attacked the Combined Army, assuming that it was an invasion force. And then they also said that once they were under attack, the Morats and the Shezvasti, since the control echelons of the Combined Army weren't there, they kind of slipped their leash, so to speak, and their actions didn't represent the hegemony as a whole. So this propaganda was also tied to a vast improvement in the livelihoods of everyone living within these territories. So once you got citizenship, you were automatically given a hegemony version of a cube. You were automatically plugged into, their equivalent of the galactic, internet. You immediately had access to all of the, trade and consumerism that was available to the rest of the hegemony. You were literally a full-fledged citizen. And remember, for a lot of these people, life wasn't actually all of that great when they were previously under, citizens of their previous allegiance. So, for instance, Eugene also typically operates as a police state where people live in fear of being reported to the government. Pan-Oceania is great if you're on one of their capital worlds and you have a really good job. Not so great if you're, a miner working in an asteroid field or working on Paradiso in the middle of a war. So a lot of these people were disillusioned with their previous, allegiance, and now the Combined Army is actually making their lives easier. But the final nail in the coffin that got people to switch sides was that one of the biggest heroes of O12, Achilles. So, one of the bravest defenders of humanity during the various Combined Army offenses, publicly renounces his allegiance to O12 and joins the Combined Army, but not as like a straight defection. He publicly declares that he's going to personally be the hegemony's watchdog to make sure that humanity under the hegemony flourishes. So he convinces large swaths of humanity who were already in these territories and saw, the improvements to their everyday life. He convinces a lot of them that, joining the combined army is the right thing to do. Now, everything is not always as it seems on both sides of the fence, actually. So, Achilles was actually pushed towards this action by Pandora, who is the starlet of the next wave action pack. She actually had a very long-standing bone to pick with Aleph, and this was her chance to sort of like stick it to the man, as it were. So she actually was a huge proponent in convincing Achilles to switch and bringing a lot of the other Greek humanoid Aleph agents from O12 over to the side of the combined army. Now, on the hegemony side, I won't spoil everything. A lot of this is covered in the Infinity N5 lore book. So if you really want to know what the hegemony is up to and, what their intentions are for humanity, I highly recommend that you check out that book. That it goes into some pretty good juicy tidbits as to, things might not be on the up and up. Now, even though their intentions might not be pure, for the time being, having humanity kind of welcomed into the fold of the hegemony does further their goals. So they embrace Achilles and Pandora and the rest of Team Achilles, as well as all of the new humans that are joining in wholeheartedly and enthusiastically. So they start equipping them with custom spec gear. Everyone who joins the new military force, the next wave, is given, top of the line gear, special made by, cadres of artisans who, have been supplying the combined army with, super futuristic high-tech gear that the human sphere was actually kind of struggling to keep up with. All right, so sorry I went on a little lore nerd rant, but let's actually focus on what comes in the box. So first up, we've got the Harbingers, which these are going to be our sort of quote-unquote cheerleader troops. They're sort of your basic line infantrymen who signs up for the next wave. So even though they're basic troops, they receive, a lot of technological enhancement, whether that be through genetics or cybernetics, gene therapy. There's also, another lore tidbit. Those EI cubes are potentially doing things to your brain. But they also get top of the line tech from all of these various alien forges, a lot of times made to the very exacting custom specifications of their leadership. All right, so next up we have the Cliffjumpers, which these guys are honestly just the daredevils of the next wave. So prior to, the humans being granted citizenship, the Cliffjumpers were people who either worked for the anti-alien resistance movements or potentially worked for one of the, black market sort of mafioso families that were operating on Paradiso, specifically in Morat controlled territory. And they would literally jump off of cliffs to evade capture and then use their flight suits to weave in and out of grab train traffic to evade the Morats from being able to catch them. and their antics were, widely sort of distributed amongst the anti-alien resistance movement. A lot of them sort of became local heroes. And with the formation of the next wave, Achilles tapped a lot of these people as potential recruits for their new military force. All right, so next up we have the Ironsides Mobile Heavy Regiment. Now, this regiment actually kind of has somewhat of a tragic backstory. So, these were veterans from the Human Spheres Coordinated Command that were on Paradiso, and they were fighting against the Extra from the Combined Army. The Extra were very overconfident going into this campaign, and they were getting their butts handed to them, like, severely. So they ended up resorting to using a dirty biochemical weapon that essentially ended up slowing down the metabolism of these fighters and literally just putting them to sleep. Like, it literally caused their bodies to literally go into stasis. So they were kind of tucked away in these underground bunkers. A side effect of this agent is that you literally don't age. Like, your metabolic processes all but stop, but you don't die. So they were essentially comatose, locked away in these bunkers. And then now that humanity, or parts of humanity, have become citizens, and these bunkers were in the occupied territories that are now under Next Wave control. We've got all of these sort of like heroes who were poisoned and then locked away, where they've been sleeping for years. Now, the Team Achilles actually ended up working with some hegemony scientists, and they ended up developing a techno-organic device that can attach to these soldiers, and it counteracts the toxin. Not completely, but most of its effects, which will let them, wake up. Most of them, when they are reawoken, are so, grateful for the opportunity to, just be alive again. A lot of them end up joining the next wave and entering military service without even being asked. Now, even though it's somewhat tragic, these Ironsides actually provided the next wave with a ready pool of combat veterans, from the inception of the force, which was actually really critical in helping all of the new troops that were signing up to get trained. Next up, we have the Contrabandoleros, probably mispronouncing that terribly, but as their name kind of, would hint, these are your smugglers. These were people who, specifically under Shazvasti rule, could go to the places where no one else could go, get supplies, and then transport them to where they were needed. Whether that was for an anti-alien resistance movement, or maybe for, an illicit black market, dealer of some sort. These were the humans who were, largely unmodified, but just had that natural gift for fieldcraft that they were able to evade Shazvasti recon patrols. So once the next wave, force was being created, Achilles tapped a lot of these smugglers and conscripted them into the Contrabandoleros response acquisition team. And in their new capacity, they pretty much operate the same way they were before humanity was accepted into the hegemony. So whether Achilles needs, couriers, whether he needs, spies, whether he needs something smuggled, maybe an assassination or two, the Contrabandoleros are the people who get it done. So next up, we have the Raindancers, which are kind of another tragic remnant of the time humanity spent under occupation from the combined army forces. So specifically in the Morat labor camps, life was hard. It was a daily occurrence that people would be killed for the most minor of infractions to make an example to everyone else. Passing out from exhaustion was caused to be executed. Life under the Morats was literal hell. So a lot of the people who, were prisoners of war in these camps obviously had PTSD. And there was one gentleman by the name of Kowina who, as a response to sort of try to deal with the trauma that he was living through, he ended up going out at night after his work shift in the rain and just started uncontrollably dancing. And he looked absolutely insane, looked like a crazed lunatic. All of the other humans in the camp thought that, he was going to get himself killed. Like, he was literally acting crazy. However, it just so happened that his dance and how passionate and everything that he was actually very similar to a religious rite that some of the Morats themselves practiced. So, whether it was for curiosity, whether it was some sort of appreciation for some sameness, the Morats actually allowed this to continue. So more and more of these prisoners of war started, participating in these dances as a way to sort of, deal with the trauma of everyday life in a Morat camp. And then once the Morat occupation was over and these remnants of humanity were welcomed into the hegemony, Achilles actually saw that these warriors had this unfathomable wellspring of rage and just raw emotion within them that they were letting out through these dances. And that could potentially be harnessed for warfare. So Achilles and Pandora ended up commissioning a special version of an cube for these warriors that would heighten their aggression in combat and make them easier to control, as well as disciplined whenever they were giving in to these impulses. So, for anyone familiar with Warhammer 40k, think of a slightly more humane version of the Butcher's Nails for the World Eaters. So these are, great warriors who lived through very traumatic experiences under Morat rule, and then their new human leaders are actually taking advantage of their trauma to still make use of them for their new army. All right, so next up, we've got probably hands down the coolest miniature in the action pack, the Tekdraken. Let's be honest, it's the whole reason why everybody's here. Dinobot. So essentially, these guys, there's a species in the hegemony hailing from a planet called Lacerta, the species being the Crotala, and they have a symbiotic relationship with a native Saurian species on the planet called the Sarganta. Now, over time, and with influence from the hegemony, once they were brought into the fold, the Sarganta were experimented on and essentially ended up being one of the first introductions of this techno-organic fusion that the hegemony started playing with. And over, countless centuries of refinement, you now essentially have made to order dinosaur pets. and they can be programmed from anything your mind can think of, from guard duty to, being part of a fire team, hatching out of the egg with guns, blades, whatever you had that specific bunch of Saurians bred for. They come out of the egg ready to go. So Achilles ordered a ton of these to his exacting specifications for integrations into the next wave. And essentially, what you end up having are, supplemental troops that are as loyal as a trained dog with the intelligence of some humans and combined army weaponry and firepower that you can literally hatch whenever you need replacement troops. And lastly in the box, we've got Pandora herself. Now, she is a member of Team Achilles, responsible for a lot of the research in merging humanity into the fold of the hegemony. She put in a lot of work in sort of retrofitting the cubes for human brains and so forth. She also does a lot of the R&D for the tech that the next wave troops are using. Now, again, I don't want to spoil the N5 lore book too much, but if you're interested in her motivations for, leaving Aleph and O12 behind and signing up with the hegemony, I highly recommend you check out that book. All right, so on to the painting. So to get started, I went ahead and primed all of my minis in gray with a spritz of white from the top with the stock color scheme, which I'm kind of mimicking in this tutorial. We had a lot of grays and blacks, so those neutral tones are going to work really, really well for most of the speed paints that we're going to use. The problem is going to be that red undersuit. So red speed paints, if you put them over white, they become very desaturated. So what we're going to do, I am base coating all of our undersuit areas in Ammo's Ionic Vanilla, and then I wash that with thinned down Croic Green from Citadel. It's one of their shade paints. It's already pretty thin, but we want to thin it down even more. So the green, as it settles into the recesses, we're gonna use a little color theory here, and this is gonna make our recessed shadows complement our reds and oranges in the highlights. And we're going to mostly have this vanilla, very, very bright yellow tone on all of our points of highlight, which will give us that color saturation in our reds and oranges. Now, to prepare for the speed paint, I'm going to go ahead and just dry brush the entire miniature in white. I specifically used Ionic White from Ammo, but any white paint that you like the consistency of will work well here. Now, once that dry brushing is complete, we're going to come in with Army Painter Bright Red. Now, this is a very orange red. If you prefer a deeper red for your undersuit, you can come in with AK Deep Shade Carmine Dawn in the shadows, so the points of the miniature that aren't receiving as much light, and that'll sort of tint everything in those areas into more of a deep crimson color. Right, and the next couple of steps are actually going to go by pretty quick. So anything leather, so bags, straps, their holsters or sheaths, I went ahead and hit with Citadel Snakebite Leather. And then for anything that's going to be a shade of gray, we're going to use a couple of different gray or black speed paints. So for the hard armor, I used Basilicanum Gray from Citadel. For the guns, I used Black Templar, which is going to be sort of a really dark blue-black. And I'm sorry, the Basilicanum Gray is more of a dark neutral gray. And then for any of the black cloth, I hit that with Army Painter Occultist Cloak, which is almost sort of a deep violet color. It's a very dark blue, but somewhat neutral and desaturated. All right, so next up, we're gonna add some definition to the hard surfaced black area, so all of that armor and the weapons as well. So I'm going to use a selection of neutral paints. So from Pro Acryl, I reached for dark neutral gray, bright neutral gray, and finally white. And I'm going in and I'm edge highlighting all of the hard armor panels and kind of doing some shadow work and some highlighting work on the flat surfaces with my spectrum of grays. And then on all of the weapons, I'm just doing hard edge highlights with pure white. And once all of that highlighting work is done, and this is the most time intensive part of the process, but it still went relatively fast because we're working with a limited palette. We're now going to apply a second coat of contrast in these areas. So for all of that hard armor, we're going to apply Griffcharger Gray, which will give it sort of a bluish gray tint. And because we've done multiple stages of highlighting before we've applied this Griffcharger Gray, you're going to get some really, really nice definition on that armor and that little splash of that blue color. And then on the weapons, I wanted the lore of their equipment to kind of come through, and I wanted it to seem kind of alien. So I'm giving the weapons a coat of Pterodon turquoise from Citadel. So over the blue-black sections of the weapons, you're not going to notice the color almost at all. But when it covers the white, you get a really bright sort of pop of that lovely turquoise color, and it really gives an alien feel to the weapons with minimal work. With that done, a lot of our work on these miniatures for getting them, just sort of tabletop ready is actually kind of done. There's not that much left to do. So next up, we're going to highlight up the leather areas. And for this, I'm using Pro Acryl Green Brown to kind of add broad highlights. And then I'm coming inside of those highlights with Pro Acryl Khaki and making sure that I hit the edges of the pouches and the holsters, and some places just adding little scratches or little dots to show distress. Now, for Pandora and the Contrabandoleros, I wanted their sort of dark blue-gray fabric to actually be kind of a lighter, kind of almost baby blue, grayish kind of fabric. So for those two miniatures specifically, I highlighted those areas with Pro Acryl Gray Blue, and then I came in with a mix of gray blue and white blue to add my really sharp highlights. And then the last real, layering work that we have to do is for those sort of bone off-white colored techno-organic armor panels. So to base coat those areas, I came in with Pro Acryl Bone, And then I highlighted like 95% of the panels with ivory. Ivory is really my real base color that I'm going for. That undercoat of bone just really helps the ivory show through without having to do too many layers of it. And then I'm adding really sharp edge highlights on the panel lines with Pro Acryl Bright Ivory. All right, and then really the only other layering work that I didn't show you guys any footage of was for the face and for the hair. So for the hair, just for simplicity's sake, I just painted all of the hair as brunettes, and that was basing with Gargax Sewer contrast paint from Citadel, and then progressively highlighted up through Pro Acryl Burnt Umber, Dark Orange Brown, and then Orange Brown. So we had three progressively smaller areas of highlight coming up from that really rich dark brown color to get that brunette feel. And then for the skin, I just used Pro Acryl Olive Skin, which is a very, very pale yellow skin tone. And then I washed it with human skin from the AK Deep Shades range, thinned down a little bit with a little bit of speed paint medium. And now the skin here is not super, super stellar. Again, we're not trying to, win a painting award with this. We're aiming to get them done quickly and at arm's length, have them look fairly decent. Right. And then really the last painting step, which this was after I'd already based the miniatures with my Geek Gaming Scene It's base ready mix and had enamel varnish them and let that cure. I came in with AK Interactive's green fluorescent pigment, liquid pigment, and you just take a really, really fine tip brush, get a little bit of the mix on there after you've given it a good shake, and you really just touch your brush to a recess where you want like a really bright sort of light effect, and you just let it go. The capillary action sucks it into that recess. You let it dry, and you get this really, really bright light effect. It works very, very well where you have a deep recess, like on the Tekdraken. It's maybe not as great on more of the flat panel lights, as you'll see in a moment, but it does a passable job, especially given how quick and how easy it is to use this product. And if you happen to get any extra, somewhere you didn't want it, you can just get a little bit of mineral spirits on a Q-tip and then wipe away the excess just like you would with an enamel or an oil paint. But otherwise, those pigments will stay right where you place them. All right, so here are some finished pictures of all of the miniatures from the action pack. I hope if you were someone who was looking to get into Infinity and you were intimidated by the level of detail that's packed into these miniatures, I hope this kind of showed you that you can use speed paints and very simple basic weathering techniques rather, to get these miniatures done and looking halfway decent on the table so that you can get your games in. And then as you buy more miniatures and you expand your collection, over time you can take a centerpiece unit and really put all of your heart and soul and blood, sweat, and tears into painting a tiny 28 millimeter eyeball. But until then, you can get your minis done really, really quick. This whole project, I managed to smash these out in just one weekend. If you take out, the drying time for using enamel varnish, which, pro tip, metal miniatures, I do highly recommend enamel varnish. Specifically, Rust-Oleum Matte Clear is my spray varnish of choice for metal miniatures. You definitely want to give these a coat because with them being metal, if they knock into something, you want your varnish to be protective enough to make sure your paint job doesn't get chipped. With that out of the way, this video is just about done. I hope you enjoyed the lore tidbits. I don't really normally do lore videos, so let me know what you guys thought of that down in the comment section. Also, I've only done the action pack in today's video, but stay tuned. I am going to probably in about a week be painting the Juggernaut miniature, which I have already primed right here. It's lovely. I'm going to be painting this in more of a detailed, layering technique and glazing and weathering. We're going to try and go all out on that just so that I can kind of show you guys the spectrum of, you can try really hard and, have something that looks amazing, or you can use speed paints and have something that still looks kind of decent. But anyway, let me know what you guys thought of everything down in the comments. Are you guys ready for the next wave? Make sure you get your pre-orders in. And thank you again to Corvus Belli for sponsoring the video. And I'll catch you all in the next one.